from that point on, when Alabama is number one in the country, we'll get into the finer points. But from a 30,000-foot view, what happened?
Yeah, that's what you just outlined was a great backdrop into ultimately what I felt like the theme of this year's team was, which was at every moment this team had to take the Bulls by the horns this season, it faltered at every single turn. They beat Georgia. They're the number one team in the country. And at that point, from 30,000 feet, it's who is going to be able to stop Alabama? They lost Nick Saban. They lost all these players. They still beat Georgia. What is this program going to look like under Kalen DeBoer? Very next week, lose at Vanderbilt. Then sky's falling, but you have an opportunity to get back into the top 5 conversation if you go and beat Tennessee. And what happens? Disastrous game. 15 penalties, all these turnovers, they lose against Tennessee.
Yeah, they had a tough time in that environment for sure. I was at that game.
Yeah. And then a few weeks later, after all of the bad losses, everything that's happened, they still had an opportunity to go to the SEC championship and go to the college football playoff because everybody around them started losing. That's the kind of the thing about this conversation is like the playoff committee is trying to force Alabama on us. Well, it's like actually all the teams around Alabama started losing, and it opened the door for Alabama to backdoor their way into the playoff. And even with that opportunity, they go in Oklahoma, they lose by 3 touchdowns, and they get left out of the playoffs. So I think that's kind of what happened to this team. They had an inflection point at the start of the year with the Georgia win, and then they were just not able to sustain that level of intensity and focus and excellence throughout the season, which, to what you said in the lead up, that's a calling card of Nick Saban and something that he preached all the time. And it sounds mundane when it's Nick Saban every single week, like, take every team seriously. We have to play to a standard no matter who we're playing. We have to do these things. But then when he's not there and you see this Alabama team fall in those moments, it kind of reinforces the point of what he was trying to say. So I think that's ultimately what happened. This team just wasn't able to capitalize on several opportunities that it had to put themselves in a position to compete for a title.
After that Vanderbilt loss, our co-host on the podcast, Damian Harris, was pretty mad. And I think he was emblematic of a lot of the way that not even former Saban players felt, but like Alabama fans felt, which, the Malachi Moore situation at the end of the game where he's throwing the tantrum and kicking the ball and doing all that stuff. He apologized for it after. But I think to Damian's point, it was a sign that there wasn't accountability and that there were culture issues in the building. And then already a lot of the foundation that Nick Saban had built was kind of crumbling, which – and a lot of times when you take over a job, that's welcomed. When you're taking over Nick Saban, people are like, don't touch the curtains, don't mess with the paint, leave everything as is, and that's just not really going to work. But overall, as they went through this transition, did you get a sense that what Damian felt like he saw and what I think a lot of people saw, the suspect culture and suspect levels of accountability, did you feel like that was going on with this team?
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel like it was a lack of accountability. I felt like at every turn, whether it was the players or the coaches, there was a level of accountability in terms of, we didn't have the right game plan. We didn't have them ready to play. The players saying we didn't execute the right way. Obviously the Malachi Moore situation, he was made available immediately after that, and he kind of had a long presser where he kind of took that accountability. So I think that element was there. I honestly think that as far as culturally, there were some changes and there were some things that had to happen along the way. But I think at this point today, the culture is actually in a pretty decent spot. And I think it's because I think you can point to the fact that their entire team is playing in this bowl game, which is not happening across the country. I mean, even the team that they're playing, Michigan, I know they had their emphatic win over Ohio State, but a lot of their NFL guys aren't playing in this game. So I think the influence of past leaders like Bryce Young and Will Anderson and Saban's influence is still there in that regard, that they want to see the rest of the season through. So I think that's a good sign. But there was a blending of cultures, and it's different. I mean, we can be honest about it. There has never been more access to Alabama's football program than there is right now. That's just one quick way to point to the difference between DeBoer and Saban. It is different, and it kind of lended itself to maybe some changes or some things differently going on this year. But I think the culture was in the right place. I think the accountability was in the right place. I think ultimately a lot of what were some of the cracks in the last few years of the Saban era we're not masked by Saban's greatness this season, and it came to a head. And that was always a conversation going into this season, was what was going to be the drop off from the greatest coach of all time to just another coach, albeit a great coach in DeBoer, who led his former team to a national championship game. But there was going to be a drop off, and I think when you think about the personnel losses, the coaching turnover, the culture change, and just a step back in terms of coaching acumen from Nick Saban to Kalen DeBoer, those were the things that kind of led to Alabama having a step back this year.
But I think the thing that was really alarming this year, schematically, Alabama was kind of simple this year. And for a team as talented as they were, it was curious. Offensively, Jalen Milroe, make a play, run around, or hit Ryan Williams deep. Defensively, when you lose, you can't stop the run, especially the quarterback run game, the option stuff. Schematically, how does that happen with a team that does have as much talent, even if there's not as many superstars in this Alabama team that we've seen, some of the teams in the last 15 years under Saban?
Yeah, I think that was one of the most underrated aspects of this season. And when we talk about Kalen DeBoer as a coach and the success that he was able to enjoy before he got to Alabama, a big part of that was continuity on his coaching staff. And he comes into Alabama, he expects to have Ryan Grubb to some degree. He hired him. He expects to have Scott Huff on the offensive line. William Ng, who was a longtime assistant under him, was going to be a defensive assistant, probably was going to head up their special teams. Chuck Morrell, who is still with the program in a capacity, but he's not the defensive coordinator anymore. They bring in a new defensive coordinator in Kane Womack. So when you think about all of those things that happened right before the start of spring practice, in some ways it kind of casted a bit of a dark cloud or a bad omen of what was going to happen at the start of the year. Nick Sheridan was somebody who was on DeBoer's staff as a tight ends coach, but obviously does not have the same play calling experience, acumen, chemistry with Kalen DeBoer. So I think that was part of it. Personnel wise, they just weren't the same as it was in Washington. And Michael Penix obviously was the thing that we're going to point to, but when you look at Alabama's receiving core, there was not the same trio of like a Rome Odunze, Jalen McMillan, Jalen Polk. I think it's actually pretty alarming, and I think we'll get into this as the conversation goes on, but the fact that Alabama's two best receivers by a long margin were newcomers, Ryan Williams, who was a 17-year-old, and Jeremy Bernard, who was a transfer, that's pretty alarming. And that's a position that Alabama used to, mid-2010s up until early 2020. They were wide receiver U. And that aspect of it was another reason that kind of contributed to the offense's fall off to a degree. But they were simple offensively. The running backs were supposed to be a really big part of the offense, or at least that's what would be assumed. That really wasn't a big part of it. Obviously, they had problems at receiver. Offensive line was good. Wouldn't call them great necessarily. They had problems with pass protection at times, so that affected it. Defensively, I think ultimately the defense actually rounded out to be a pretty good unit, but it was feast or famine. I mean, if Alabama's defense wasn't forcing a lot of turnovers, they were kind of being had in terms of allowing points, allowing yardage, and those type of things. So I think the defense actually rounded out to be a pretty good unit.
The backs stand out to me because, I don't watch tape of recruits. I'll keep track of who's recruiting what. I kind of know what's going on, but I'm not in the weeds. But then when you watch those backs, Haynes and Miller, I'm just when you're comparing them to guys like Najee Harris and Derrick Henry and, Mike Host, Damian Harris, and some of these guys that you've watched play at Alabama, and you watch them and you're just like, oh my gosh, these guys are unbelievable. And then you watch these guys, they don't really stand out, especially in a year like this where, you got guys like Cam Scattaboo and Ashton Genty and these guys that just are so far above their competition. It just seemed crazy to me that Alabama, other than Ryan Williams and some defensive guys, just didn't have anybody that just made you say, wow, very much. And that they'd be stuck with Milroe, who I still think is kind of limited as a passer, and this, receiver who's 17. We talked a lot about it all season. How much was youth an excuse for this team this year? You look around, Xavier Brown, Bray Howard, Jalen Mbakwe, guys that were young, still playing a lot of snaps, still contributing. I don't know that you'd call this a young team, but how much did youth contribute to a team that lost 3 games and 2 that they had no business losing?
Yeah, I think it was a part of it, and I don't know if I would call it youth as much as I would just call it newness. because there were some guys that came in that you may not say was a young guy, but were just new to the program. A lot of them were the spring transfers. Damani Jackson, somebody with a lot of talent at USC, but starting at cornerback 1 for Alabama is a big jump from where he was in the Pac-12. So newness. LT Overton coming in and playing a big role after being a highly touted guy at Texas A&M. So they had a lot of newcomers on the team, and I think that played a significant role. On top of the fact that you have a new defensive coordinator and a new system on that side of the ball, you have an unexpected new offensive line coach. You have an unexpected new offensive coordinator. All of those things played a part in it. And youth, when you talk about defensive back, they played a lot of freshmen back there. Alabama was susceptible to giving up a lot of big plays in the back end of the defense, so that played a part in it. When Ryan Williams is your best wide receiver, it looks great when he's torching Georgia, but when you are a freshman, no matter how old you are, and you hit an inevitable freshman wall, that is going to affect the offense because he was the biggest play guy on the offense. So that played a part in it as well down the stretch of the season. So I think it was a factor. I think next year they're going to be able to mitigate some of those things when you think about Ryan Williams taking a year 2 jump. When you think about Jeremy Bernard coming back for another season and being a really good complementary receiver. You think about Xavier Brown. He could potentially be all SEC cornerback next year with the confidence in the year that he had this year. So should be a lot better in 25, but there's no question that when you lose 40 players to the draft into the portal and you're replacing them essentially with an entire freshman class and what you were able to get in the spring portal window is going to significantly affect your team.
Simply put, who is to blame for this season being what it was?
Yeah. Ultimately, it falls on the head coach. And that's kind of where I'm going to have to point to. This is something you're leading the program. You're in charge of coaching decisions. You're in charge of personnel to a degree. Some of that was out of his hands with the winter portal window and the spring portal window and all of those things. But at the end of the day, you as the head coach are responsible for this. So if the offense sputtered, you can point to hiring Nick Sheridan as offensive coordinator. You can point to the fact that Kalen DeBoer wasn't the play caller this year. If the defensive side of the ball wasn't up to par, well, you have a sitting head coach as your defensive coordinator, another head coach as your defensive backs coach. You had a lot of experience on the defensive side of the ball, coaching wise. Kalen DeBoer put them in those seats, so it falls on Kane Womack, the DC, and Kalen DeBoer for hiring him. Special teams was pretty much a disaster start to finish this year. It didn't live up to expectations. Again, Kalen DeBoer decided to hire an analyst in that position, not have at the time a full-time a staffer. I know the rules changed a bit, but he didn't hire a full-time special teams coordinator at the start of the hiring cycle. So all of these things kind of lead back to him as a head coach. Do the players have accountability in this? Obviously. I mean, a lot of the games that they lost, penalties were high. Jalen Milroe turned the ball over in a lot of key moments. So obviously you can point to the players and their execution as part of it. But, ultimately this falls on the head coach. So why wasn't Alabama a playoff team? Why weren't they able to be consistent week over week? It starts at the head coach, and that's where I will point to start.
I think you're right, because I think the thing that you sort of alluded to it, there's a bunch of stuff that went wrong for Bama this year. Like, they screwed up in a bunch of weird ways that we don't see from Nick Saban teams. You score 3 points at Oklahoma. You give up 40 on the road at Vandy. You have the parade of penalties at Tennessee. When there's so many, it feels like you spring one leak, you fix that, there's another leak there. I think you're right. I think it has to go back to the head coach because those problems were popping up all over. It wasn't like, well, I inherited a bad offensive line situation. We couldn't block that much stuff, and then we played great defenses. We just couldn't score. That, I'd be like, well, that's kind of your predecessor's fault. But I don't think anybody in any way, when you inherit the situation that he did, is going to give him any breaks for, hey, your predecessor might have hurt you here. I don't think that's gonna fly. I don't think that's gonna fly when your predecessor's got a statue outside your stadium.